So these questions really just cover DARG, the history of DARG, and your own career within DARG, and in a roughly chronological way as well. So the logical place to start with that really is what were you doing before you came to DARG?
Yes, before I came to Loughborough, I was in a department of psychology at Lancaster University, a very good department of psychology, and a very liberal one. At the time, if you looked around psychology departments in the UK, they would tend to be, as they are now, largely cognitive psychology, experimental psychology, with a broad range of things. But I was lucky at Lancaster of having 3 or 4 social psychology colleagues, and that was unusual at the time. Usually we one social psychologist amongst 2 or 3 cognitive psychologists, a developmental psychologist, biological psychologist. So there's quite a concentration of social psychology at Lancaster. But I was increasingly feeling that the kind of psychology even they were doing, we were doing, was still within an experimental psychology framework. And I'd heard that there was this discourse thing happening somewhere in the world. So I started to read up on discourse. And eventually a chance came to go to Loughborough, where I knew there was a very intensive and well-regarded group of people doing discursive, as it was called then, discursive psychology or discourse analysis. And I thought, well, I'll pack my bags and go. So I came.
Okay, and how did you first make contact with Loughborough? What was the process there?
I'd been around and about in conferences like we all did, and we all do, and I would come across people like Jonathan Potter and others who were at Loughborough or knew about Loughborough, and I formed a very strong impression of what they were like. Mm-hmm. So I thought, yes, well, let me try and see if I can go and join them somehow.
So do you remember what it was like when you first came to DARG?
Very well. I remember it because I didn't have a room in the department. So this isn't exactly DARG, but it shows what happens when one arrives at a place and one's expectations are somehow not quite what they were going to be. So not having a departmental room, I was put in a porter cabin in the car park. And the advantage of that was nearer where DARG was meeting, so at least I could pop out and be very quickly in where DARG was meeting. And DARG at that time was pretty heterogeneous. We had people from a variety of strands of interest. It was a large group, and we met in a hut somewhere with too many people for the chairs, so people would be perching on each other's laps and on each other's shoulders. Not quite, but it was certainly felt a bit sardine-like. And the kinds of discussions we had were very wide-ranging. They weren't circumscribed by disciplinary considerations. So we had sociological things, we had philosophical things, we had things about both ethnomethodology and conversation analysis. Quite a mix at the time. This is about 96, 97, that kind of time.
And looking back on DARG as it was when you first arrived and DARG as it is now, what would you see as the main things that have evolved since then? What changed?
Well, it has changed, there's no doubt about that. And it's changed in large part because the personnel has changed. So we don't have the same variety of people coming to DARG as we did then. Many of the people who were around then have gone. There were sociologists and broad social scientists who were there who have now gone. I'll give you a few names because these are people who aren't with us anymore because they've retired. Mike Gain has gone, he was a sociologist. David Middleton has gone, he was a psychologist. Derek Edwards has retired, of course, and he was, of course, in the department. People who then arrived a little later after I did, people like Cedar Kitzinger and Sue Wilkinson, they were psychologists and CA analysts, they've gone as well. And they brought a feminist agenda, which is now not so obvious in DARG. So because people who'd been contributing at the early stages moved on to other jobs and professorships and what have you, the thing has changed. I should also say that it's changed also intellectually because certain threads and strands won out. It's not a competition, and it wasn't meant to be a competition, but people gravitated towards a different kind of, let's say, discourse analysis, And those words themselves fell out of use and fell out of favour, perhaps. And people got much more interested in what became eventually, now I think, the centre of gravity of DARG, which is conversation analysis. That had always been a part of discursive psychology, which Jonathan Potter and Derek Edgeworth have championed. But they themselves became more concerned with the methods by which one did discursive psychology and became expert in conversation analysis. And that expertise and that sense of a method and a way of working transmitted itself through postgraduates and new researchers. And you could see the success it was having in both programs of empirical work and publications. And so it became a rolling, self-fulfilling sort of project that generated its own impetus. And now I think it is very much the central part of what DARG is. Not to exclude other kinds of things that DARG also is home to, but I think if there was one thing that you'd expect if you went to a DARG meeting at random, it would be a close analysis of talk and text, seen through the eyes of, well, ethnomethodology, but more particularly conversation analysis.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned postgraduates. Who were your first PhD students that you had when you came to Loughborough?
Well, arriving late, I didn't, late in the sense of DARG having already been established for some time, and not having in the department seniority at that time. I didn't have postgraduates for many years. So my contribution to the postgraduate supervision was quite muted compared to other people like Mick Billig and Jonathan and Derek, who had a lot of postgraduates and were very influential in bringing in new ones. And as was Celia Kitzinger, and she brought, with Sue Wilkinson, a lot of postgraduate energy into DARG.
And had you supervised postgraduates before you came to Loughborough?
Yes, I had. At Lancaster I supervised a few postgraduates, but again rather within a sort of more traditional social psychology setup. So they were doing something qualitative, and I was feeling my way into supervising them. Only when I came here did I feel more confident about supervising a more explicitly qualitative and eventually conversation analytic kind of postgraduate project.
And what would you say the main difference is between supervising a more traditional social psychology project and supervising a conversation analysis project?
I think the difference might be that in a more traditional, let's say, experimental social psychology project, the method is really not much up for grabs. Once you've identified your question and the scope of it, you want to then specify various things like the materials and the timescale and the design of the experiment. But the method itself, that's to say, you present people with something and under different conditions and see how they respond, and then use their measurements in some sort of quantitative way to see whether there's a difference between A and B groups and so on and so forth, is pretty well given. With qualitative work, then the method and the analysis are much the same. That's to say, the person will go out and collect her or his data, and that may take time, may take comparatively short time, and then most of the time of her or his endeavour is spent going through these data very minutely and analysing it and thinking about it and turning it upside down and pulling it apart at the same time. So the method is very much imbued into the analysis. So it's not something you can say in advance, well, it's going to deliver you this. Whereas if you had an analysis of variance, for example, you knew that there was going to be, you're going to be testing for a main effect and an interaction, and that if there was interaction, it would tell you that this was more likely than that, and so on and so forth. But with something like a qualitative piece of work, be it discourse analysis, be it ethnomethodology, be it conversation analysis, the way you deal with the data in front of you is both methodical in the sense of you do A, B, C, D things in that order, but also analytic in that what you're doing at any one time is contingent on what you've done before and has effects on what you do next. For example, if you identify by exploration a particular practice that somebody is using to do a certain thing in her or his interactions, then you follow that up wherever it may lead. So it might not be predictable from the beginning what's going to come out at the end. The sentiments are predictable, that you're going to be looking very closely and using the apparatus of whatever it might be, conversation analysis. But where it leads is not predictable. So that's a big difference between an experimental, shall we say, social psychology and one that is much more concerned about the qualities of what you're seeing in front of you.
Mm-hmm. So one of your major works is Explaining and Arguing book. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the origins and ideas behind that book.
Well, my abiding memory of writing that book was of taking a car with a colleague of mine who was a Foucauldian and driving all the way through France to a rather shabby apartment we'd rented on the outskirts of Barcelona, him to finish off his PhD and me to write this book. So we ensconced ourselves in this rather bare apartment in a working class neighbourhood of Barcelona, emerging in the evenings to go and have a drink and some food. And being locked up, well, not quite locked up, we could leave at whatever time we like, but sharing an apartment with a Foucauldian for a month was a very interesting experience. I don't think it had any effect on what I wrote in that book, but it did make me think about what I was doing and quite where this was going. I brought with me, as he had himself, his own materials and his readings and stuff. So I had this pile of books and papers, all, of course, in those days printed out, so you had to work through them. And now what I wanted to do was to say something about how it was that social psychology had a story about what people did in explanations and what they did in arguments, and contrast that with what could be said about them if you weren't constrained by social psychological methods, which at the time were heavily experimental. I didn't go quite as far as thinking of them in more societal and cultural ways as a Foucauldian might have done. I wanted to stop at the station of thinking about them in terms of the ordinary experience of explaining, the ordinary experience of arguing, and that led me into inevitably pragmatics and eventually some sort of discourse analysis. And I was still feeding my way into conversation analysis at the time, but I knew that if you wanted to get a handle on what somebody was doing when he or she was arguing with somebody, then you had to go through the argument sequentially and seeing how it developed and where it was going and how it worked out in real time. And the same thing for explanations. Social psychology at the time had this strange view that explanations were in the head, that you, as an ordinary person, would be explaining by dint of doing some sort of method of difference in your mind, where you would discount so much this kind of cause on the basis that it didn't occur in more times than some other cause, and so on and so forth. You would come out with a causal attribution, as it was called at the time. Well, that struck me as being just crackers. And the thing to do was see how people actually explained in the real world what they chose to explain, how they chose to explain it, and what that explanation did in the run of their everyday experience and what it did in that local interaction and where it got them. So that took up the bulk of the book, and I was at the end pleased that I'd moved from a social psychological point of view to one which was broader and put explaining and arguing in a much more everyday and real experiential setting.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your own interests have developed since joining DARG, and particularly how they've been influenced by being part of DARG.
DARG is a very influential setting, I think. The fact that it's extremely routine, that you go there every week, you know it's at 1 o'clock, you know it's on Wednesday, and you know that there'll be an opportunity to look at some piece of data and argue about it. And that's been true from the very beginning. In the beginning there was also some theoretical discussion, and we would take on quite big topics to try and talk about. I mean, that has somewhat diminished over time as we've settled on a fairly comfortable philosophical, if you like, way of looking at the world. But that means that we have a lot more time for looking at something in some minute detail and seeing how it works, be it text or be it talk, be it video as it is nowadays. And that has meant that you've had to mind your P's and Q's in claiming what you can claim about something that's happening in the world. And that's been a wonderful discipline for us all, I think, that in other kinds of, let's call it discourse analysis, my sense is that the burden of proof is a bit lesser, and that the need to show you're working is less salient. In conversation analysis, which is something now we're much more comfortable with in DARG, it's really quite important to be able to say, the reason why I'm saying that this is happening is just here. And you can see that at this point, X, Y, Z. And you can pull in all kinds of resources from your reading, from what has gone before, from research and concepts you've picked up. But eventually you're going to have to be able to say, well, that is the case, given that this other thing which we all agree on is also the case. And that's often to be found in the very sequencing out the way that something happens over time in the particular piece of data in front of you. One big thing which has always been a discussion point in DARG is whether locating your explanation in the current run of events, talk, misses out or doesn't miss out on something important. And that has fallen away as a discussion, to be sure, over these last years, but it was quite important and quite salient for us early on. That issue of context. What counts as something which might explain what's going on? And we would run through the usual kinds of demographic explanations, the cover sheet explanations of age, gender, class. And eventually we argued ourselves into a position that I know one shouldn't homogenise DARG in a way that is unfair, but I think it's now a fairly taken for granted thing in DARG, that although arguments might be made about the relevance of age, class, gender, they would have to be located, again, in the details of the talk. And it would be somehow, not cheating, that's too strong a word, but difficult to ground your claim that the factor here of importance was, let's say, racial identity, without being able to say something about where it might be seen in the data. Now that is still an arguable, and it would be mad to ignore that there are things that happen in the world which aren't affected by weak, let's say, in any one interaction, some force in the background which is weak but nevertheless present, and that might not be visible in the way that something pans out. And what you'd want then is distributional evidence that pans out, in this case, more than in others because of some factor which isn't necessarily visible. But to take a cautious approach is one that allows you to be at least certain about what you do say. You're not certain that you've said everything that could be said about something, and that's fair enough. But what you do say is reasonably, publicly defensible on the basis of what you see in front of you. And that's one big discipline that I think DARG has had a benefit for everybody who's gone to it, whether they eventually agree with it or not, but I think that's something which has made its mark.
So looking back over all of the DARG sessions that you've been to over the years, is there any one that stands out to you as being a favourite or being particularly memorable?
Well, DARGs have changed over the years, and they've been characterisable in different ways. In the early days, the discussions between people like Mick Billig and Mike Gain and others who came from a different point of view, different to what we are now, were more rounded. They're more sociological, more social scientific. They took on big things like class or prejudice, or things which would involve a great deal more mobilization of your general social scientific apparatus, your being as a social scientist. And that has to some degree fallen away, and that's regrettable to some degree. On the other hand, we now have brilliant explications of what's happening in individual cases, which are deeply insightful in a narrow way, and they show you something which you hadn't realized before about just the everyday world of it and how it works, and that is something which is a great advantage. So the change in spectrum over the years of DARG has brought two different kinds of ways of doing social science, and the one that we have now is much more focused on the particular and less on the general.